to another Bearded Geek toy review. In today's episode, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Don't worry, it's not a rant. But what I wanted to do is talk about those toys that we had when we were younger. Every collector has a holy grail list. And by that, I mean stuff that either they wanted when they were a kid and never got because the parents, Santa, whatever, never bestowed those gifts on them, or stuff that they had and unfortunately either sold or gave away or gave to charity or their cousins or whatever. And you kind of like look back when you're at a toy fair or at a Comic Con or a memorabilia fair and you kind of like see it on a stall and it's there and it's now going for 500 quid and you're going, damn, I had that. I wish I kept hold of it. Now, in the instance of obviously me being a huge kind of like fan of certain franchises, I was fortunate because I kept virtually every single item of my Star Wars toys from the late 70s and early 80s from when I was a kid. So all the stuff that obviously was released by Palitoy, I've got all my original figures. I've got all my original vehicles. I've even got one that's still in the box, the AT-AT. One of my very first videos, I did a kind of like unboxing of that because it's like kind of like stashed away, and I would ultimately like all that on display at one point, but I haven't got the space at the moment. However, I did have other stuff that, looking back now, I kind of like regret getting rid of or donating, and I think a lot of it went to people like my cousin, or I traded for other stuff like you do when you're a kid. You kind of like, oh well, you've got that and I want that, so, and then your friend from school says, well, you've got that and I want it, and you do a swap, and sometimes it works out and sometimes you're giving away something that's worth a lot of money and you're getting something that's not worth as much back. Then your parents get hold of it and kind of pull you by the ear and say you get it back because we paid a lot of money for that. I think I remember that actually happening once when I was a kid, but I don't recall what the item was. But there you go, there's some like hazy memories from being a kid. So I've got the vintage Star Wars stuff, but there is some stuff from the Star Wars range that Palitoy and Kenner did that I requested and obviously never got. So they're going to be some of the items on my Holy Grail list. Also, some of the items are going to be stuff that I had as a kid and, like you say, gave away or parents sold or gave to charity, that I look longingly on and say I'd really like that back into my collection if I could afford it. And I'm probably going to make a bit more of an effort over the next kind of like 12 months or so of looking for these kind of like Holy Grail items, whether it's going to be on eBay or auction sites or special toy fairs or Comic Cons, just to see if I could pick myself up a bargain and reclaim those hazy days of my youth. So here are my top 10, and there's a couple that are doubled up, so it's a bit more of a top 10-ish, but here are my top 10 Holy Grail items, starting at number 10. So number 10 are the Corgi die-cast vehicles, mainly the James Bond Aston Martin DB5 and the Adam West 60s Batman Batmobile. These were probably two of my favourite cars that I had as a kid, and obviously, if you come from a certain generation, you have a huge amount of cars. I think before Star Wars came along, it was kind of like the toy that you got as a treat if you went shopping, with your mum or your parents. Went to and got yourself a little Matchbox vehicle, or if you were a little bit, extra, you got one of the larger kind of like Corgi diecast or dinky toys. Now, obviously with the DB5, obviously I've got a kind of like a more modern version there, but this doesn't do anything, doesn't have the ejector seat, doesn't have the things that come up at the end, you know, so I would like to add that to my collection. And same goes with the Batmobile, because I remember playing with the Batmobile, and I also had the die-cast Batboat and the Bat helicopter as well. And I remember playing with those as a kid. Gave me a great amount of joy, and it would be really, really good to add those back into the collection. I do know that Corgi have kind of done a re-releases of these, and I think they currently have the Aston Martin as a re-release on their website. I think it's around about 25 quid, but it's the original gold version, and obviously, as we know, the DB5 was actually silver in the James Bond film, so I'd rather prefer a silver one if I could pick that up. And again, if I can find a Batmobile that's accurate to the 60s series, and I think that would fill in my collection. Doesn't necessarily have to be a Corgi one, but something along that die-cast kind of feel would be great. So that's number 10 of my Holy Grail items. Now here's number 9. So number 9 is the Mego, the Incredible Hulk 12-inch figure. Now, obviously, Mego were very, very big in the 60s and the 70s, and mainly known for producing 8-inch action figures. But I had the 12-inch Spider-Man Mego figure, as well as obviously a couple of 8-inch ones. I think I definitely recall having the Human Torch for some reason. I had the Lizard, who was one of Spider-Man's enemies, but I did have the larger Spider-Man, and I always wanted the larger Incredible Hulk one, because at the time that was released, the Incredible Hulk TV series had just debuted on ITV, and I do remember actually going to see the pilot, which was released over here in cinemas as a feature film back in the day, and I have vivid memories of that. So I never had that. I did ask for it, but the Incredible Hulk 12-inch Mego figure is one of the figures that I would like, if I find the right price, to add into my collection. So that's number 9. What about number 8? Number 8 is the Imperial Shuttle from Return of the Jedi. Now, obviously, as Return of the Jedi was released back in 1983, I was about 10, and then obviously later on in the year, I turned 11. So I was getting to that stage where a lot of adults were telling me, well, I think you're a little bit too old for toys now. But I do recall that Christmas 1983, I still got quite a lot of Star Wars action figures, and I remember getting the Troop Transporter, which I still have, as well as some other things as well. The Imperial Shuttle, from what I recall, wasn't released over here by Palitoy until 1984. So obviously by that point, toys were an absolute no-go, and I remember the Christmas of 84, didn't get any toys at all, because I was told you had to be grown up now, and you had to like think about others. So kind of like records and computer games and books kind of like replaced those items. But the Imperial Shuttle was always one, when I saw it in a catalogue, or actually saw it in a shelf in a toy store, I absolutely thought it looked brilliant, and I thought it would make a great addition to my Star Wars vehicles, and it just looks so good. So obviously I'm aware that they do go for quite a premium, the original ones from 1984, especially if they're boxed, but again, I'm not precious. I probably wouldn't be looking for a boxed one anyway, but that's probably number 8 of my Holy Grail items that I would like to add to my collection. So here's number 7. Number 7 on my Holy Grail list is Action Man. Now, I had a lot of Action Men when I was a kid. I think I had about 2 or 3 of them, and I had quite a couple of the vehicles as well. including the kind of like strange, I don't know what it's called, but it was kind of like it was a vehicle on wheels, but then you added wings and then it became a flying vehicle. But it wasn't quite a helicopter, wasn't quite a plane, wasn't quite a car, but it was one of those strange kind of like assault kind of vehicles that they came up with. And I also had the training tower as well, which was really, really cool because that was absolutely huge and you could set that up and then you could have action men slinging down on the rope to the bottom from the top of the training tower. So I had an action man, the one that was my favourite. He had blonde hair and he had the eagle eyes as well, which had just come out. The ones with the little lever in the back of the neck where you could move his eyes and his eyes would go from side to side. So it's a standard soldier one, and I presume that they probably don't go for too much. I think probably some of the rarer action men are probably going to be the ones that, like, are in different uniforms or like came out earlier than the kind of like 77, 78 time that I remember getting Action Man. But Action Man would be a great addition to my collection, and I really do have fond memories of playing with them and the vehicles, obviously until Star Wars came along, and then kind of like the bigger action figures were kind of like superseded by the smaller ones. But that's number 7 of my Holy Grail items. Here's number 6. Number 6 on my Holy Grail list would be the Star Wars Y-Wing vehicle. Now this again was one of those vehicles that didn't come out originally with the first couple of vehicles in the Palitoy Kenner Star Wars range. So it wasn't the X-Wing, which was the first vehicle that I got, and it didn't come out at the time of the Millennium Falcon or the AT-AT or Slave One or the TIE Fighters or Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, which are ones that I had. But again, it came out around about, I think, 1983, 84, because I think I recall it only ever having Return of the Jedi on there, even though it was more a prominent vehicle at the end of the first Star Wars film rather than being featured much in Return of the Jedi. But it's still one of those iconic vehicles that looks really, really cool and would look great in a display. And again, I did ask for it as a kid, but obviously because it's falling in that latter time bracket, kind of like told that, well, toys are kind of like not the thing anymore. So unfortunately, the Y-Wing fighter was something that I never got. Now, obviously, you fast forward to the mid-90s, and then obviously Kenner, now owned by Hasbro, kind of like relaunched the Star Wars figures, and a lot of those original figures that were re-released with the Power of the Force range in the mid-90s were actually from the original molds that Palitoy had. I've got a A-Wing on display next to my Lego Millennium Falcon over there, which is actually from the mid-90s, even though it was released, I think, in 1985, but it's the exact same version except for the paintwork is a little bit more detailed. So obviously, given the cost of it, I'm not adverse to getting a 90s version of the Y-Wing, because I never had a TIE Fighter. I only had Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, and a couple of years back I got a cheap 90s Power of the Force TIE Fighter because it was based on the original molds of the one from the 1970s. So that's how I filled that gap in my collection. And if I was to find a Y-Wing from the 90s, that would happily satisfy that gap there. So that is number 6 in my collection. But what's number 5? Number 5 is the first Doctor Who themed related item that we've got. And actually it's a bit of a cheat. It is 2 things. It is obviously the Tom Baker 4th Doctor action figure, which was done in the 8-inch Mego style by Dennis Fisher, which I did have as a kid, but again, I don't know why. I think I gave all my Doctor Who kind of like related toys away, which is a bit of a surprise really, because Star Wars and Doctor Who and Marvel were my three big things that I was into as a kid. But also I had the TARDIS, which came in the same kind of series by Dennis Fisher, and obviously had that unique thing where you put the Doctor or another action figure inside the TARDIS, you spun the light at the top, you press the button, and then open the doors again, and then magically the Doctor or whichever action figure you put in there had disappeared. And usually I always remember as a kid thinking, well, shouldn't it be the other way around? Shouldn't the TARDIS be disappearing? But obviously, we don't ever have that technology for toys. But those are two things that I did have as a kid, and I would absolutely love to have them back in my collection. So that's number 5. So moving on, what's number 4 in my Holy Grail list? Number 4 on my Holy Grail list is something that's kind of like related to Action Man, but it's Action Force. Now, Action Force, if you don't know, was kind of like Palitoy's version of kind of like shrinking down the 12-inch Action Man series and making it more like the 3.75-inch action figure size that Star Wars had been so successful with. Now, initially, the first wave of figures were all based on Action Men that had previously been released. So you had an SAS kind of soldier, you had a standard soldier, you had a soldier in desert fatigues, you had a diver, and then obviously for the second wave, they kind of like created a bit of a mythology for Action Force, and they divided it up into 3 teams: the Z Force, which was like kind of like the ground infantry, SAS, then they had Q Force, which was the undersea version, and then you had Space Force as well. Now, the thing that I would really love to have back in my collection is the SAS Panther and Stalker figure. So the Panther was the SAS Jeep, which was all black with kind of like yellow piping and decals on it. And the Stalker figure was actually based on G.I. Joe's Snake Eyes figure, which is why he looks so cool. I would actually love to get a G.I. Joe 6-inch Snake Eyes, because obviously it's related to us in the UK. We think of him as Stalker rather than Snake Eyes. But I do remember finding that figure really, really cool. And because obviously he had more articulation than your standard Star Wars figure, because he had bendable knees and he had bendable arms, meant that you could actually sit him inside the Jeep properly. So I would really love to add the SAS Panther and Stalker back into my collection. So that's number 4. What's number 3? So number 3, and we're back in time to Doctor Who, and we've got the Palitoy talking Dalek. Now, bizarrely, there was a Dalek figure that was released in the Doctor Who Dennis Fisher range, and Dennis Fisher was actually a subsidiary of the company that owned Palitoy. And a little interesting fact for you is when the Star Wars rights were kind of like being offered around to UK toy companies under license from Kenner in the US, Dennis Fisher actually turned it down because they said, well, we've already got the Doctor Who range, we've just launched it, it's been quite successful for us, but we'll pass it over to one of our other subsidiaries, which was Palitoy. And then obviously, look what happened. Star Wars took off, and Dennis Fisher kind of like went back to making board games, I think, after that. So even though Dennis Fisher did a Dalek, it was kind of like, it wasn't talking, it was kind of like in the wrong shape. It had a red dome, whereas the Palitoy talking Daleks were a lot more accurate, and they came in 2 colours. They came in red with black kind of like orbs on the skirt, or silver with blue orbs on the skirt, and I had the silver and blue version, and I would really like to add a Palatoy talking Dalek back into my collection. So that's number 3. I wonder what's number 2. So try that again. Number 2, and we're sticking with Doctor Who, and it is, of course, the Dennis Fisher giant robot. Now, if you are a fan of this channel and you've seen my review on the character options version, or if you've listened to any of the Track 1 Doctor Who podcasts that I sometimes appear on, you'll know my love and want of this figure when I was a kid. I absolutely loved the K1 robot design, and it was one of the figures that I regularly asked for, and I think for some reason it was one of the ones that wasn't really widely produced. Obviously they did a lot of the Tom Baker Doctor figures, they did a lot of the Cybermen figures, same with the Dalek, the K9, the Leela and the TARDIS itself, but I think obviously the K1 giant robot wasn't made in as large numbers as those other figures, which is probably why it was a little bit harder to come by. I do remember asking for it, but I never got it. And I just love that iconic design of the giant robot. So I was so pleased when Character Options eventually did their own version, which you might be able to see on the shelf behind me, just over there. But I would love to have the original in my collection. So that is number 2 on my Holy Grail list. But what is number 1? Number 1 is, and it's no surprise, it is a Palatoy Star Wars item. It was something that was actually quite, I think, readily available. It's the Star Wars Death Star playset as made by Palatoy, not the Kenner one. The Kenner one was never available over here in the UK, and it's the kind of thing that I wasn't even aware of until obviously I started getting reference books about Star Wars figures, and they had a completely separate playset that was mostly all plastic and was just kind of like various bridges of the Death Star, but wasn't round at all. The Palatoy Death Star was actually a very kind of like cheapish item that was easy to produce for Palatoy. It was essentially a cardboard playset, but it was obviously had different areas of the Death Star, and it was kind of like half a sphere, and obviously you had certain sections. You had the trash compactor, you had the chasm in which Luke and Leia swung over, you had the bridge, you had the docking bay. So you had lots of different areas where you could spin it around and obviously have your figures in and go from different sections to sections. And it was one of the items that I really, really remember asking for as a kid. But I think maybe because it was cardboard, my parents might have thought it wasn't worth the money to buy one. And fortunately, it's the kind of thing that does go for roughly around about £500 if it's in a really, really good condition, because obviously it's cardboard. It's firm cardboard, but it's cardboard, it's not plastic, so it's going to deteriorate easier. Now, a friend of mine from school did have the Action Force headquarters, which came out several years later and was actually the same design as the Star Wars Death Star playset, and I remember him bringing that round and playing with that, obviously with Action Force figures and Star Wars figures, but I always wanted the Palatoy Death Star playset, and I think I'm going to have to save up a bit if I've got any chance of adding that to my collections. So that's my top 10 Holy Grail list of items that I would love to either get back into my collection or add to my collection because I never got them as a kid. What are your top 10 items? What's the thing that you always asked for every birthday and Christmas? and then was always just a little bit disappointed when it wasn't there under the wrapping paper? Or did you have some of these items as well, and you, like me, stupidly gave them away or sold them off or gave them to charity or gave them to a cousin or your nephew or something like that? I would love to hear from you in the comment section, because I think this is a great topic for collectors. It's always about that stuff that we used to have as a kid and then we want back when we become a proper collector in our adulthood. So anyway, I hope you liked the video. If you do, please leave us a like. It really does help out the channel. If you've not yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button and also that notification bell to be notified whenever we upload any brand new videos. In the meantime, stay safe, take care, and you will see us very, very soon on Bearded Geek Toy Reviews. See you now.